Hi, this is Brennan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm here with Robert Conley, Nick Seidler, and Adam Balderstone, and we are going to be talking about authentic medieval gaming. A week ago, Rob ran a session for us of a medieval authentic campaign, and we live streamed it, so we're going to post a link. It's up on Adam's channel. And today we're going to talk about sort of how that went, and just the idea of what an authentic medieval campaign can mean. So I don't know. Why don't you guys, just opening thoughts, and then we can kind of get into it.
Well, I did not participate. This is Nick talking. So I did not participate in the game, and I was not 100% sure what authentic medieval meant. And I think maybe that was the point of this game lab. And so in my mind, I originally thought that authentic medieval would mean, no monsters in the setting, or that one would have to adhere to the very strict rules of, medieval culture at the time, or at least in my mind, Western medieval sword and sorcery, or not sorcery, but, historical. And when I watched the live stream of you guys playing, I realized that we had slightly different definitions, which is, I think, where this topic came from. And so maybe we should let Rob explain what his vision of that was.
Sure. Basically, to me, when I do work on cultures, religion, all the background stuff, I do that because I enjoy doing it. But when it comes to gaming, what it primarily does is support it provides a foundation for how NPCs behave, because that's the only place where it really shows up. If you look at our world, and you can read a lot about history books and stuff, but really where it shows up is how people in, say, Alabama act compared to Pennsylvania, compared to Ontario, Canada, compared to France, Germany, Thailand. All of that is a product of their history, their culture, and their religion. So when it comes to running campaigns using D&D and games related to D&D, the backdrop is obviously Western medieval Europe. That's one of the foundations of what makes D&D D&D. So to me, what authentic medieval is that the people that you encounter, the peasants, the nobles, the merchants, act like they do in our medieval history. Now, there'll be some modification because obviously I am not using Western Europe as the setting. Instead, for that game, I was using a very light version of my Majestic Wilderlands. But since I set it in a similar time period of Western Europe and similar circumstances, where they're part of the economy, it, had some money in it, but wealth is mostly tied into land, so hence you need a feudal society if you want to raise and support any kind of military for it. So, using how people acted in the Middle Ages really helps me with my campaign set in that setting. So that to me, what authentic medieval is. If you look at the question I would ask any of you when watching it, did any of the NPCs, not the more fantastic one like the Russet Lord or the other creatures in that dungeon, but did the NPCs feel like they stepped out of the pages of medieval Europe?
And I would say, to me, yes. I think that, and it was the things that you were emphasizing. So, the importance of stuff like patronage, that kind of thing. There were many instances where, you understood how agrarian the society was, and the role of the church and things like that. So it felt to me, and I think Rob's right. It was coming, from the way the NPCs were interacting with the party. one of the reasons why we did this too is because there was an ongoing discussion on the RPG site about this, and we were with where the idea of authentic medieval gaming had been discussed, and people were kind of all over the map in terms of what that meant, and there was a lot of differing opinions, and so I thought it would be, Rob does this a lot with his games, and so I thought, getting his idea of a medieval authentic would help clarify things. It would at least at the very least, it would provide an example of what it can mean, and so that was sort of the aim here.
Yeah, I think one thing you really got right is that a lot of people seem to act like a feudal society is almost like totalitarian, like no one has freedom and everything's very strict hierarchy. But the fact is, because of the lack of communication and so on, you have situations like you had in this where the abbey here is being really corrupt because nobody comes along to look very often, and I mean that feels authentically medieval to me. The fact that it's a difficult thing to go check up on what's going on in different regions, and the people in each area are somewhat autonomous to an extent, even though they're part of this very hierarchical structure. I thought that was a good touch.
I thought there was having had a chance to watch the game that you guys played, it started in a way that many games do not usually start, which I really liked about Rob's gameplay. And that had to do with when Brendan's character, and forgive me because I don't remember all the names, but when he was
Simon Pepwell was my character.
Yes, yep. And as he was introduced in the very first transaction, it mattered who your father was, and it mattered how well your father was doing. So suddenly we think of our characters as independent, but Rob had introduced, the whole idea of the family and how the family gets along with everyone. And another thing that I really liked about the game in terms of making it authentically, medieval, was that it was not expected that you as a lone adventurer would be able to solve this problem on your own. The reason that you guys together ended up working, and then eventually you added somebody to your party, but when the two adventurers first started off, it was literally like, I'm sending you to take care of this problem. However, I want to send some muscle. I want to send a knight with you.
Yeah, that was a good setup.
It's very
that
different
was a very
than
good
how
setup.
a lot of people... Yeah, it's different than how people D&D play, where you assume that everyone is able-bodied. But now it was definitely culturally, we need to send the muscle with you. Like, there's a reason. So
yeah, and the thing is, it's like going back to the nature of a medieval society. Once we were out there, we were working for the bishop, but he's days away, so we're kind of free agents to an extent in how we do what we need to do for the bishops. I mean, you didn't get to any of that because you didn't get to watch the whole thing, but we had to be very creative in how we dealt with things.
And I will point out, even though there wasn't any immediate check to your freedom, because the British, if you recall, the bishop was pretty vague on how to get his tithes.
Yeah,
but the bishop will be paying attention to the result, and that will determine whether you will receive his continued patronage. Because if you go in there and tear up a thing and basically, bust up the abbey to the point where it can't really function as a pilgrimage site or effective revenue stream.
Yes, that was not his intent.
You're not going to get those kind of jobs anymore. That's that's going to. But however, if you do a really good job, and then the bishop will think, I got this other problem here, or I got this estate that needs to be run. Maybe these guys can do it for me.
Well, and the thing too that Nick had mentioned, family, I thought that was something that for me as a player, because we were kind of really taking Rob's lead on this. We were just going in saying we don't know what Rob's idea of medieval authentic is, so we're just going to go in open-minded and just whatever Rob presents us with, we'll accept that and try to lean into it as best we can. And the family thing for me was one of the more helpful aspects of it, because I was able to connect my character to the setting in a concrete way. And it also did place certain restraints on my character as well as giving me levers I could pull. So, and I find that just in general with historical gaming, one of the first things to go out the window in a normal D&D game is family. Like, that's where, the murder hobo thing is all about the lack of, connections to the community or to family. And the thing that can really bind people back into a historical setting, I find, are giving them family ties, or at least asking them about their family ties. So, okay, who's going to care if something happens to you, or if you go and you tarnish the family name or break the law, and, the government, if it's a society with collective punishment, there's things like that can become a useful way for setting elements, I think, to become important, because that was a lot of the stuff that had to do with how marriage was being approached, had to do with the family situation that I was in.
I remember the first time I played in a Wandering Heroes of Ogregate game of yours, Brendan. You were like, okay, it's very important. You've got to roll on the generating your family stuff, because the family stuff's really important. So as soon as Rob brought your family into the game, I'm like, oh, Brendan's going to be happy. That's
I will roll on. I got tables that mostly crib from Harn, but for generating somebody's family tree, and but I try to do it with a light touch. I try to keep it approachable. Mm-hmm. So, for Brendan, we really didn't get into his mother. We didn't get into his brothers. He had a brother, but that's it.
We knew that I was I was the second son, right? That was the information.
Yes,
right.
Yep, that's what you said.
Right, and and he had a relationship with his father, and he didn't, and the only really parameter they had, he was a bit of a ne'er-do-well, going around having a good old time, and his father wasn't quite too happy with that.
Well, I felt a little bit like Blackadder from the very first season.
Yeah, there you go. And and that's all I generally go in at first, and then if other details are needed, I just work them in, and either work with the player, or if it's something that needs to be done behind the screen, then I'll do it myself, and it builds up from there. But my general philosophy is that the best magic item a PC can acquire is another PC.
Oh, nice.
And so there's always opportunities to build relationships. And the other thing I got to really stress is for people listening to this and want to do this in your own game, you got to deliberately force yourself to make sure that at least a third of this stuff doesn't come with any undue complication. In other words, it's not. A lot of players are paranoid about this because they view it as a way for the DM to screw over the player. Yes. So it's important to have, if you want to make it feel real, whether you're doing medieval or ancient Mesopotamia or Rome, it doesn't matter what setting of the past that you're putting in, or even present. You got to make sure, like in real life, some relationships are, are great. They're just a benefit. You enjoy them. There's few, if any, complication. The majority of your relationship, or maybe we'll just call it a third, because we're venturing, so there's always going to be complication. The middle, or it's just going to be indifferent. They're there. They're not necessarily beneficial, but they're not a hindrance. And then there's the third that are full of complication, like a sibling that always gets in trouble when the law comes looking for you to find out where your brother is, that kind of deal. Or in a recent example of my campaign, the players collected a bunch of NPCs to train them up as henchmen and stuff. And they went off for an extended period of time down south, and they didn't really leave their house guarded well, and they messed with an NPC in a previous session, and the NPCs messed with those people they left behind, basically mind controlled them to act like unwilling spies. And the players were kind of really annoyed. The players were, oh my God, we're still dealing with the fallout of that. in that campaign. But on the other hand, when they went south, they went to this city, and they weren't having a good time dealing with city official. They're very much a gray party, but the city they went to is notorious for being corrupt. And they went in there, and this official, basically during the conversation, he figuratively put his hand out, and one of the players goes, it's like a light coming on his head. It's like, I offer him 2 gold crowns if he, and he came up with this like, yes, we understand your predicament and inconvenience. Well, here's 2 gold crown to cover your inconvenience and expedite it. And everything went smoothly because they paid the bribe. And, there was no reason to screw the PC. It didn't make sense given the context. And, they dealt with that situation for 2 sessions, and they were really happy afterwards. So it's really important not to keep a balance in what kind of complications you poise the players, or they will avoid it and try to become murder hobos.
Yeah, if every family member becomes a hostage or betrays PCs, they avoid them. If anybody they develop a romantic interest in and marries does something terrible to them or becomes a hostage, they'll avoid that. They need to come with the same benefits and downsides that they really would have come with, so that people are motivated. Otherwise there's no motivation to engage that aspect of the setting. So,
well, I think a good model to look at from early gaming is, one of the things RuneQuest tried to do is get players more involved with the world by having the cults that players belong to, and cults would require sometimes, you've got to go do this job for us, but it's also meant you got cheaper training. As you ranked up in the cult, you'd get cool stuff and cool benefits, and those cults are a great way to get players invested. They're part of the world. They're part of this organization in the world. And families, a medieval family is the same kind of thing. They're an organization. If you're part of a noble family to an extent, they're your family, but they're also a power structure. And yeah, you need to balance that. And I think that's fun. We've been playing, Hillfolk with the drama system starting yesterday, and that's a game where your family is both can be an ally and be a hindrance at the same time. But family's a complicated thing, and it should be complicated, but it needs to be interesting, and I think it's a big benefit to games.
Go
on.
I was going to say, one of the things that I observed in the game was that as Rob introduced family elements, and while it was an important part of the game, he often let the players make the decisions, even though you guys weren't quote unquote forced ahead of time to think this through. He gave the players the opportunity to flesh out their background. So, Brendan got in the situation very early in the game in which he was asked about his father and how his father was doing, which allowed Brendan to decide the level of friendliness that they had. He's like, we've kind of patched things up, he kind of talked about that. And then later, Brendan had the opportunity to expand on the fact that he had a brother and that he was not the only person in the family, that he was the younger of the 2 kids.
Well, that was established before play.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, that detail was. We knew that I was the second brother when I made my character.
And I like the way that was that question was in relation to you potentially marrying that girl you weren't really going to marry, but it's like, you're the younger brother.
Yeah, that was
the good stuff.
That was the sort of thing that was I thought
that's disappointing.
Yeah. Now, Rob, what resources and books do you recommend for this street level type of detail? Because I got to say, I took multiple courses on medieval history, and I found it didn't equip me for running a medieval game. I had to go and get a lot of this sort of ground level information in specific types of books that you wouldn't necessarily. So I think you could read a lot, like you were saying, you could read a lot of history books, but you still might not know what people in Alabama are like. So what are the resources for medieval stuff that gives you a handle on how to run it at the ground level?
To be honest, it's not so much you want to read the books after you get the general outline in your head, because they will flesh out various effects. But to get that general outline in the first place, I recommend, and I'll type this in the chat, I recommend HarnWorld. Wait for a sale. They're a bit pricey, by Columbia Games. And I recommend Fief by Lisa Steele, and I think it's also under Cumberland Games.
And we'll post links in the description too of the podcast for that stuff.
Yeah,
Can you send me those links
have
by email, Rob, after the podcast, so I can put them in.
Yeah, I'll do that. And the last would be, and there's Ars Magica has medieval life book that's really good. And what the authors did, they tried to take the mass of information and distill it into something that's gameable. Now, I think, i.e., this is a reason why I should write my own. But sometimes I think they focus a little too more. They focus too much more on the structure and the law and the hierarchy, so to speak, and not enough on the personality. But it's there. It's there. The idea, family is all, patronage is key. The idea that you keep your word was important, because it's the only way they could function with the lack of a sophisticated legal system like they had in ancient Rome and in later time periods. And so man's word was the only thing that bound two people together, at least in the early medieval ages. So all that's in there. But you read that, once you get a grip on the outline, then start reading the, just browse, if you have a Kindle or browse Amazon for various medieval books, like, for example, Life in a Medieval City, Life in a Medieval Castle. Oh, and there is one game that's good, one thing that's good for an intro, and it is called the Peel Affinity. And it might be a bit pricey, and I'll send a link to that. But it's a picture book by a group of reenactors, and it's really good. And it follows, it's in 2/3 of it follows the life of an evil family throughout the course of a year, an entire year, from winter to winter. Then the last 1/3, and the whole conceit of it is you'll as you progress through the year, you'll learn that the knight whose household they're following is got a contract to help out with the 100 Years' War, with a 100 Years' War, and then the last third of the book is about his service, the result of him preparing, and it gets into the medieval life, the details of living on the campaign, medieval-wise. But the Peel Affinity, that is actually, overall and above all this, the HarnWorld and Fief have the logistics, but the Peel Affinity really brings it to life. I'm going to give you that should be the primary link.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I find there's a type of book called the microhistory, which that might be. I'm not familiar with that book, but those can be handy if you find a specific area of Europe you're trying to model, and getting a microhistory on something that happened there at a date that approximates what you're looking for. That can be a real good sort of street level view of things, I think.
I'd like to ask this question, and that is that I am familiar that GURPS came out with a classic Middle Ages book, and I think maybe even a Middle Ages 2 book. I don't have them. I'm just putting a question out there for you guys of whether or not any of you guys have used that as a resource.
Uh, I have. It's it's the same as Harn. It's not as good as HarnWorld or Fife, but it's there. If you already have it, then then you don't need to bother with HarnWorld and Fife, basically.
Yeah, and one thing I would say about HarnWorld too, and I don't know as much about it as Rob, but I got into Harn through Bill, and Harn is really good at giving you sort of they're really good at making I don't know how I would phrase it, like mundane stuff interesting and fun to engage. They do a really good job with their adventure material and stuff like that. And the setting, it's all very sort of, I don't know, I think it does a really good job of explaining itself.
Oh yeah, Harn to me is the gold standard for all this stuff.
Yeah, I think you could, and it's vast. Harn has they have a lot of material. You could spend your whole life, I think, buying Harn stuff, and you know, probably not finish.
But I will say though, it's not, what the lack of a better word, independent. You can pick up sections and it would be immediately useful. For example, in the Majestic Wilderlands, I use plenty of the Harn settlements. When I don't have time to draw my own, I'll just pull out a Harn town and or a Harn castle, and use that for the settlement. Maybe rotate it, flip it, but they can, if you understand how medieval history works and stuff, and you don't really have to have a deep understanding, you just understand how the general gist of it works. Just about anything in Harn can be made to work.
Yeah, and again, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's the only thing that really is tied together is the rules.
And
found.
Oh, God, I keep interrupting you. I apologize.
No, that's all right. The only thing or the rules like Harn Manor, Harn religion. Well, maybe not Harn Manor, but the religion, magic, and the Harn rules are, of course, rules oriented. So, okay.
But yeah, and I mean, and again, that was one of the things, like I was saying at the beginning of this, the thread, which I should mention, started when the Lion and Dragon book came out, and that was described as a medieval authentic, and then that prompted the discussion about what medieval authentic is, and it was just striking how, like, I don't know, maybe I had a different reading of the threads than you, Rob, but my impression was people really had there was, number one, there was a lot of confusion about what medieval authentic should look like, but there were also very strong differences of opinion on it, and so I think it's just really helpful to kind of sort of sit down and try to illustrate it at least with an example here of Rob's campaign, and and so yeah, so I don't know, was that your reading of it, Rob? Do you think I got it right, or?
Yeah, I think I think it's part of the, there's always a bunch of debates in our hobby, like miniatures versus not using miniatures. Well, simulation, it's another divide that divides people gaming style. And I think when I was reading through it, my impression is, even though it was about authentic medieval, it was about, I think most of the debate was, how much simulation you ought to be doing, and that's where I think the big divide came, because people hate it. People don't want, when they hear that, they're thinking, they're thinking Monty Python, mud and down in the mud, mud cake peasants and bloody swords, tyrannies, tyrannical rule, and they don't like that, and even though that's not how it really was, some of it was there, obviously, but not the extent that people often think it is. But that.
Do you guys think that there might be worry in some players that they may not know as much about medieval culture
Yes.
as, say, a specific game master, or that they might do something that would be considered not authentically medieval. So some people are maybe reluctant to participate in such a setting because they don't know that culture or subculture as well. What do you guys think about that?
I think people are worried about that. I think there's also the other issue of sometimes you get the player in the room who knows a lot, and that can be good or bad depending on how that player handles that. But what we were trying to do is I think we were trying to really let Rob sort of be the leader and set the tone for everybody, and we would follow. And so we kind of went in with like child minds, where it's like we're just playing and we'll see what Rob wants. I think if you can do that, if you can run a game for players regardless of what their knowledge of the period is, and guide them through it, then that's a sign that what you're doing is working. And so I don't know, Rob, what is your feeling on player expertise and how necessary that is?
Yeah, it's definitely a factor, and I learned over the years on how to work around that. That's why I rely on stereotypes a lot and stuff. I don't know if you guys picked up on it, but sometimes I really played into the medieval stereotypes. So you guys can just
gamer's friend, definitely. I mean, yeah, when you're trying to communicate something at the game table, stereotypes are very useful.
The other rule I have is if the players opt to do something that's background, let's lack of a better word, background intensive, where it's historical or whatever, I'm very generous about do-overs. I.e., to me, and I try to be very liberal with this in my mind, so I'm not projecting my own assumptions on what the players ought to know. If the player looks like to do a boneheaded maneuver that's totally out of character for somebody of that setting or time period, I would say, hey, wait, this is what you really want to do because this is blah, blah, blah. And I know you already said it, but if you want to reconsider, go ahead. And, it's about half and half. Sometimes they go, you're right. I wasn't thinking about it that way. I'm going to do it this way. Or the other way, nope, that's what I wanted to do. Hit me with the consequences. It's like, okay. And as the players play more session in my campaign, then I'm mindful when my campaign starts, especially with a new group of players. They're all strangers in a strange land. Okay, even if I was setting it in actual medieval Europe, who among us knows what it's like in Artios in France in 1750s? Or not 17, the 1350s. Now, I did the research, but none of you guys. The chances of any of you guys did a research specifically for that campaign on Artios of 1350, it's highly unlikely. So, no matter what I do, I'm forced to act as a teacher and a guide at first to all these strangers who are in a strange land. And if I want a successful, it's my interest to learn how to do that well in order to have a successful campaign.
And and I think I don't know. I feel like there's always going to be a learning curve with unless you get like 3 people who are professors of that period of history or something in your campaign. The chance, especially if it's an obscure or just less traveled period, you're gonna they're gonna have to kind of pick it up as they go for the most part. Though I'd say I've had players in my group where I had a player or two that knew more than I did, and that's another thing that can happen that you kind of have to prepare for. And if you're really going for, like, again, it depends on how historical you're being, but if you're really going for historical, one of the things I find is I tend to use that person as an encyclopedia, and that tends to work, at least for the purposes of a game. They might be wrong, I don't know, but at least in that moment I'm getting some information that's useful for gaming.
I think one of the tricks to making this setting work properly, right, is for players, even if you know more than the game master about a setting, to sit back and allow the game master to present their game and the setting the way they see it. right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the same. Like to me, I kind of consider this like a player game master respect issue almost more than an accuracy issue, right? I don't think that the two of you would have ever interrupted Rob. Like even if you were like, hey, they didn't really have camels in the Middle Ages in Europe, or like if he introduced that element or something, because I think what was more important was the setting and the style of gameplay. And I think very often new role-playing groups or younger role players are more apt to have arguments between the players and the game master over smaller details, whereas I think as you become more experienced as a player, you're willing to say, I see that the game master is doing their own twist on this. Yeah. And I think there's something to be said about how it's kind of inappropriate for a player to interrupt or correct a game master about something in a game while it's happening, as opposed to maybe talking to them later or saying, hey, here's something that might not exactly be accurate. I think we've all, over the years, because we're pretty experienced gamers, have seen both of those situations. But to me, I think the important thing to take away here is that if a game master gets something wrong about a setting, and you happen to be the person who's super knowledgeable about it, send them a text message or send them a ninja note. Don't publicly correct them, because it might be very intentional for their setting that they're doing it differently, and that, you know, it's not necessarily at the place of the game table to interrupt the story just for the sake of some accuracy. At least that's my take on it. Maybe you guys feel differently.
So my opinion. Rob, why don't you go first?
Well, if you read my post, I have strong opinions on stuff, but overriding all of that is, as a player, I'm not saying I'm perfect because I'm only a human, but I really try to avoid correcting a DM. What I focus on is I like to, when I play, the thing that I like the best about role-playing game is the role-playing, pretending the acting part. I love it. I mean, I'll think of a personality for my character, and that's what I will play. And if the DM tells me that I'm playing in Europe, medieval Europe, then I will make a character that fits in medieval Europe and role-play them accordingly. If the DM has camels or other details wrong, you know, the only thing I can see getting me bent out of shape if I feel like I'm playing like a guy in a medieval Europe, but I can't because the DM keeps saying no, like the old paladin, you're not following the paladin code. Well, you're not acting like a proper peasant. I think I am, but other than that, you know, so I don't really care about what these details. It's because to me, what's really important in all this is how the people act. If the DM has the people acting like they're in medieval Europe, you know, then he's done his job. And then the flip side, if I'm the DM and I have a knowledgeable player, and you know, if he's an asset, great. There's no problem there. But if he's trying to continue to nitpick me, the first thing I do is that I do a lot of, as you guys saw, I do a lot of first-person role-playing. I engage you. So that's a great distraction for people trying to nitpick, but they're, you know, if they're bringing them up, hey, but there's camels here, and I'll have a merchant come up, hey, would you like to buy this donkey I have over here, dude? I noticed you're packing off for a journey, and you know, and immediately, you know, the player has to, you know, role play, and you know, I don't think I don't do it blatantly, but I try to subtly do that, get that engaged. And going, but if it really forces down, then I'll just put on my DM hat and say, my setting, deal with it.
I think one thing is that we are all game masters. So when we play in someone else's game, we know exactly how difficult it is to run a game, and it's like we're not gonna go, "Hey, you're doing this wrong," because I mean, but for me, when I run a historical game, I make up front that, hey, this is my interpretation of this period of history. For the second we start playing, when we're making our characters, everything we're thinking about history, but going forward, events that happen don't have to be the actual historical events that occurred. I'm trying to be accurate, but if I get something wrong, that's it. But you just need to roll with it. And but yeah, I like Rob. I like your idea about how as long as you can play the character that you designed, you're fine. It's like you're not if you're not going to tell me how to run my character, I'm not going to tell you how to run your game, and vice versa. That seems like a fair divide there. And
yeah, the closest that'll come to telling the people how to run their campaign is when they take they take a paladin or cleric, an agent character. A character that's definitely not a free agent, but an agent of a higher power. Then your boss is going to have opinion, but that's all in game.
That's part of the contract of the character class,
right?
Right.
Yeah. I think go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was going to say. I think Adam was onto something that I think bears, repeating, or maybe it was you, Brendan. I can't remember. I'm sorry, but you're right. We all do run games, and as a game master, I think we're always willing to give space to the game master to create the setting that they have. I run a Doctor Who role-playing game, which means that we go back in time very often, and also to different cultures.
Yep.
And I think as a game master, I think if you're doing well for your players, you take the time, like Rob did, to set up and learn as much about the history as you can. But in my campaign, because we're going to a lot of different times and places, the best that I can sometimes do is a quick trip to Wikipedia, because this week we're going to ancient Japan, and then the next week we're going to be in Neanderthal, France or something. However, I think taking the opportunity to do at least a certain level of research is very important for game masters, to at least try to get as much of the setting right, even if it's some of the details or locations. What was engaging about the game that Robert was running for you was that it was pretty immersive. He really clearly understands medieval Europe, right? And the more detail that one has to the culture, how people act, I think the stronger that is, right? Yeah. And so clearly, if you're going to like feudal Japan, that culture looks different than medieval Europe. So making sure a game master takes a little bit of time to research that, I think, is valuable for everyone at the table. But also, if you get it wrong, like you guys were saying, if you get it wrong, in a sense, making no apologies for that is okay, as long as everyone's kind of, along for the ride. Like you said, not everybody's a PhD in history in this area of study. And even if they are, they might disagree on some aspects of it, right?
Well, they might know political history, but not like they might not know much about like the physical culture or something. Like you see that on Facebook all the time. You see people that know an epic amount of, like this is what tool they used for this. And, somebody could, have 6 years of history and not even encounter that much of that. It depends on what your area of focus is. And so I think, but I want to talk about research, and I want to sort of put that on a hanger and get back to it. I think that's really important. But I wanted to answer your question, too, because I did have something to add there, which was, for me, when it comes to correcting the Game Master, in my own campaigns when I've done historical stuff, it's really more about the level of respect that the player is giving and why they're doing it. If they're doing it just to show off, I find that's the worst type of person to have. If there's just a demonstration of knowledge for its own sake, that can be very disruptive. But one thing that I did in my Wuxia campaign, and again, it's not strictly historical. I'm not worried about anachronisms and stuff, but I want some of the cultural details to be right. Is I had a guy in the campaign who knew the language, lived in China, knew things just that we didn't because we didn't live there. And so I gave him freedom to I said, if it's really important, like if I'm really, really getting something wrong, feel free to weigh in. Don't be forceful about it, but feel free to let us know so that I can adjust in that situation. But otherwise, like you were saying, give me a message after the game if it's a detail that can wait. But if it's something that's like I'm catastrophically getting this wrong, I don't mind if I wanted to open up that channel because I felt like it would allow me to improve the game as I was playing. But I think the thing that made it work was we both sort of respected each other, and it wasn't a contest. It was at the end of the day we wanted the game to kind of function a certain way, and so leaning leaning on the expertise of a player who knows a language you don't can be helpful in that situation. On the research topic, the thing that you said that I thought was interesting there is that you're running a Doctor Who campaign, and so one of the things that is good about that is you're in the Doctor Who franchise, and so when you're in the Doctor Who franchise, I always sort of say you got to sort of know what movie franchise you're in when you're dealing with history, not in the sense of it's going to play out exactly like an episode of Doctor Who, but in the sense of what are the expectations in terms of how accurate this is going to be. And Doctor Who gives you a little bit of license, I feel, to if you want to throw a harmonica in somewhere, you can probably explain it away at a period where it wouldn't belong, and you can and people can be a little bit anachronistic because it's fun and it's amusing. So whereas if you were if your franchise was the Elizabeth movies, then you might have to be you might not be able to get away with as much. So I think that is another consideration for stuff like this. So in Rob's campaign, later in the session we encountered some fairies, and that was totally on the table. So if whether supernatural elements are okay is another thing.
Well, certainly if you read what medieval people wrote, they certainly believed they lived in a supernatural world. So, as far as I'm concerned, that is authentically medieval. It's just that we as 20th or 21st century people know that the game mechanics make fairies real. So they are real, really real. While in our history, we view them as purely fiction and legend, maybe grounded in some weird incident that happened in the 7th century in this region, and now they think that forest is haunted by fairies, and that story kept being told over and over again, and it got embellished to the point where now you have these fantastic beings living there, or it's a memory of the myth of the ancient world in classical period, distorted through Christianity and distorted through telling it over and over again, each embellishing it a little. But
I was gonna make a comment about that where they would see it as fairies and lights that they see in a swamp. We now know that there was swamp gas, which caused people to fall asleep, and they remember seeing the fireflies. So to them, they're falling asleep, but we know better now, maybe, So
yeah.
I'm using that as an example.
If you're running a Doctor Who adventure, it's like, the swamp lights are really these aliens doing something. You can throw that in there, and that totally fits. But
well, and I think the point Rob was making is that the authentic aspect of it is this is sort of fits in with what the people at the time believed. That was actually a big point of contention in the threads that we were referring to, where how much supernatural is permissible, and my feeling on the supernatural stuff is, number one, when it's in keeping with the period, then I feel that's fairly authentic. That to me is but number two, supernatural makes a game so much easier to run sometimes. Like, I can run a game that has no supernatural elements in it, or no science, for doing Doctor Who, no sciencey stuff or no aliens. But I don't know. I feel like you have way more tools in your toolbox when you put supernatural on the table. So, I've run games that don't have supernatural, and you can do it, but it's more challenging, I think, and you have to put a little bit more work into to how you're going to keep the players adventuring all the time if you're not able to have goblins show up every once in a while, or but yeah. So I think that the fairies added to the sense of the setting as a player in that game. I thought that it was, especially the way it was done, because it was done in a very sort of traditional sort of style of fairy. It wasn't. It didn't feel like it was. It felt more plucked out of the Middle Ages than out of the monster manual in that case. So,
I mean, Ars Magica is the medieval game I've run more than anything else. So I'm completely comfortable with the idea that you're working from, everything people believed in the Middle Ages is true. It's an easy thing for me to go with. I had no problem with that.
Yeah, the only D&Dism which you guys didn't really encounter was the orcs. Because if I was running this in Europe, it would have been a Mongol war band or something of that, a local cultural enemy instead of orcs. But it's what I had on, it's what I had on hand for the scenario. So, but like I said you were kind of out of it, Adam, but I was explaining that, after we wrap things up, basically what you guys stopped was the whole premise of it was that, the Russet Lord, in my setting, fairies are what they are because magic can be found in physical form, concentrated and used. I call it viz, okay? Like the morning's dew or a perfect flower. These can all be sources of magic and used in magical rituals and spells.
Like in Ars Magica.
Also, yes, it's ripped off from Ars Magica. And repurposed for my own setting.
It's a good use.
But I took it a step further in that not only it manifests itself in physical object, it can manifest itself in sentient being if there's a sufficient concentration of mana, and it is the scene of something of great emotion. Now, it is possible for sentient beings not to be involved if it's like a place of particularly, like the Grand Canyon would have fairies in my setting, because it's just a place of such majestic beauty and wonder that anything that comes across it will feel enough emotion that their beings will, the fairies will be. But most of the time, it's because of some place where at the right time, at the REM motion, a group of people or an individual experience some form of strong emotion. Now, if the emotion is basically positive, like love, charity, hope, then you get a summer fae being born. If they're negative, like fear, terror, despair, then you get a winter fae. For the Russet Lord, the primary story that gave him birth was a village that was being rent with dissension because of two lovers of different social classes. In their particular case, it was a noble son falling in love with a peasant woman, and the father going nuts over it. And this led the village to be, the village wasn't being properly defended anymore because they were fighting among themselves, and an orc raid came out of the forest and just leveled it, killed everybody. And out of that was born the Russet Lord. And the Russet Lord was, now when a fairy first born, they were relatively weak, and they get stronger by mastering more stories. But, so the Russet Lord mastered and became a Fey Lord. However, he always tries to reenact his primary story because that gives him the most power. And in this case, he saw an opportunity where the nobleman's daughter liked the son of the smith, and with the corrupt monks and the tyrannical bailiff letting things go at the manor, there was just a fertile ground. So he took advantage, sent a fae into the woods, found a willing group of orcs, found an orc band that was willing to listen to his minion's honeyed word. And so the minion got the orcs ready for the right moment, while the russet lord sent other minions to encourage their love. And finally, you guys stumbled into the beginnings of that when they just ran off.
And I should say we do have a link, which we'll put below to the actual live stream of the game, so people can check it out. I think it's a pretty fun live stream to watch, actually. Rob was saying, he likes acting, and you can definitely see that in his portrayal of the NPCs. And so it was. I had a blast, and I've also just heard from people that watched it and enjoyed it. So, but yeah. So we're kind of getting close to the hour, so we're gonna have to end it soon. But do you guys have any final thoughts on the topic before we depart?
I do, and I will say that. First of all, it's okay for any game master or player to bring whatever level of authentic culture that they want into their game. There's no requirement for anyone to be authentically medieval or not to be authentically medieval. I think the trick is to find what you want for your game. And as somebody who did watch that live stream, I have to say how Robert ran it and how it was set up. In the situation that you guys played, it looked like that twist or requirement absolutely added to the setting as I observed it, as you guys played. And so I think it's a way to bring a different feeling to a game. And I think it's a great way to set up kind of a new setting and culture in a way that a lot of people don't initially think of bringing something to a game. And so, but I don't feel that anybody needs to have that requirement. So, but I would love to play in that game that you guys had a chance to be a part of, and it seemed like it really added something to the flavor of gameplay.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off your comment and say that I think people need to feel comfortable, even if they don't know a whole lot of history, to run a historical game. I'd rather have there be more people running historical games and getting details wrong than having everybody being afraid to do it because, well, I just don't know enough and I don't want to look stupid. And I think a lot of people that know about history scare people away from the genre, and it ends up hurting everybody in the gaming scene because of it. So.
Well, I would agree with that, and one of the things that I would also say to people who maybe feel intimidated by it is, when I took my history courses, one of the things that always struck me about the teachers, especially the good ones, but pretty much most of them, is the amount of times you'd hear the words "I don't know," and I think that's always a good starting point for knowing more. Do you know what I mean? So it's when so if you don't being comfortable with what you don't know is useful, and being able to say it is useful.
It is. Well, running a game in Rome where you don't know what you're doing as a GM is fine, because the longer you do it, you're going to keep picking up details about Rome over time. And then, after you've been running that campaign for a year, you're an expert on running a game in Rome, and you only got there because you were willing to do it when you didn't know much.
Well, I would say that focus first on getting the people right. The details, whether you got the right kind of toga, describe the right kind of toga, or whether the person's office is an adelaide or a praetor, or in the case of my game, like a bailiff versus a reeve versus a Hayward. I mean,
yeah.
Focus on just imagine you're in a medieval village. You go up and you talk to the guy, plowing the field. just imagine in your head what that's like. Then go and talk to the Lord of the Manor, and then go in your mind talk to the leader of the village, and try to build that picture up in your mind. And then when you play, translate that picture into how you role play. And then it doesn't. And I guarantee you, if that comes off good, they won't really care about the details that much. They may point out one or two things, but that's it. Get the people right. You'll be good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the important. Ultimately, I think what is like what Adam was saying before too. You really want people to sort of enjoy history and have fun with it, and it doesn't. If people are nervous, it's it's like you said, that ignorance that they're worried about is only going to last so long, anyways. If they're engaging it regularly, so. The important thing is to kind of focus on the stuff that you can do, and everybody should be able to do characters and be able to at least, put whatever knowledge they have of the period into the characters, and then just roll with that. And as they play longer, they might learn more details that they can add, but it's not, a lot of this stuff is detail. It's not stuff that, like, nobody's going to die if you get a detail wrong about how the imperial bureaucracy works or something. Do you know what I mean? You can remedy that down the road. So,
right. And, for example, and I'll do a quick example here. Say you're playing you said, oh, I want to be a knight's son like you did, or a baron's son like you did, Brendan, and if the DM is, if you took the time to learn, most, by and large, the average for peasantry is to treat nobilities with respect because they're like on a higher plane. But if you do it through the role playing of the character, the player will quickly pick up on the fact that, oh, wow, this is kind of expected. And then when it doesn't happen, that something's off, or there's an ulterior reason. And hey, maybe that's where my adventure is. Why is this peasant, not treating with respect? What's going on here? Aside from being insulted in the first place, but that's not the normal, and the same with, role playing with churchmen and merchants and, and all that. So, it's like, it's what they say, show, don't tell, show, that's how you do. That's what you do in role playing game. You show by role playing, not tell them.
That's a really useful one in particular, because you're talking about showing the players how people see them in the society, and that's something that even in a modern setting you can lose sight of. Like, hey, if I'm like dressed like a biker, people might react a certain way when I walk into the cafe. So I think that's that's a really useful tool in the GM box in general, and in particular in the history. So all right, so we're past the hour point, so I'm gonna end it here, and we will return next week with the next Brave Archer discussion in our Friday night topics, and we will probably be back next month with another one of these game labs. So all right, we'll be back on, and we will talk to you later.